Hi everyone. So we're back in the Sparkle office, which is currently more of a shed than an office, but in yesterday's story I saw all those blank walls with no plaster on them and no images, so as you can see I've decorated since yesterday's story. There's a reindeer riding a bicycle. It's my decoration. So today's story might be the last in a little bit. I remember we wanted to start this for something for people to listen to while there was an issue on Sunday, and that issue actually got resolved pretty quickly, and then there were a few others that technically got resolved on Monday afternoon, and it doesn't matter. In any case, we think that the bugs for some of you have been resolved, and that now you can join the other group that's been in the system now for a little over a week and enjoying all the browsing options and search options and listening to whatever story they want to listen to. But I was just having so much fun, I wanted to do at least one more, and probably I'll do a few more during this Advent season. So this is a story called The Bodgers Apprentice, and I chose it because today my younger boy went to school the first part of the day and came home early. He has a part-time school situation, and he wanted to come home early because he was tired. And you have to understand that a few days ago he actually broke his arm, and he's fine, everything is well, but just when you're healing, being with people can be really tiring. But the other part of it is who he is. He's what I would call a sensitive child. Actually, both of my children are, and I actually think I am too, but I'm a sensitive grown-up. And what that means is that when something happens or when you're in a space, you notice more things than other people. And not just with your eyes, but with your ears and with your skin. And, pardon me, every now and then the computer does that. And even with your heart, you can sense things that are in a room that other people can't necessarily see or sense or feel. So that's what it is to be a sensitive person, and a lot of people can walk into a space and be totally fine, whereas people who you might call sensitive people will walk into a space and receive so much feeling and so much information and so many sights and colors and sounds and touches. It just feels a little too much. And it can feel like a burden when you're young. But in time, that actually turns out to be something very beautiful and something to be grateful for, because you can appreciate so much. And my children are that way, and I think in part that's why I do what I do. So this is a story about a sensitive person, a boy who's actually treated like a young man, who's 10 turning 11. This was a long time ago, when boys at around 10 or 11 were expected to take on an apprenticeship. Now, in some cultures, the girls were as well. In this particular one, it's mostly boys. And back then, pardon the traffic again, remember I'm in a shed. Back then, the boys usually followed in their father's footsteps, who followed in their father's footsteps. Well, this is a story about a young boy, a young man almost, named James. And James was in a family of redsmiths, which is to say that they worked with copper. Generally, redsmiths made dishes and pots and pans and cookware and things like that. It was actually a very skilled trade and something to be proud of. Well, James was turning 11, and it was expected that he choose an apprenticeship. And the assumption, of course, is that he would be a redsmith, but he had made it very clear to his parents that the job of being a redsmith was not something that was a match for him. for the reasons we talked about earlier. There's a lot of sound and a lot of touch and a lot of smoke and steam and sudden things in being a redsmith, when you're heating and pounding and annealing and the steam and all of it. It was too stimulating. It was too much for young James. So he wanted to do something else. So his parents, his mother and father, made suggestions. There were a number of different things he could do in his town. It was a large enough town to support all sorts of different things. He could be a hat maker. He could be some other kind of smith. He could be a tailor. He could be a cook. He could work with wood. He could work with metal. He could work with leather. All sorts of things. And they made many suggestions, and every single one of them, James wasn't so sure. You see, he kind of liked to lie down on the ground and look up at the trees. That's what he liked to do. He wasn't very fond of hard work, heavy lifting, repetitive things. He didn't much care for things with lots of instructions. And when he was asked to do something in his household, he did what was asked of him, but never any more than that. He was a slow-moving, contented boy who liked to dream. And none of the apprenticeship options that were presented to him sounded like a good match to him. Well, that was okay at first, but then over time his mother and father began to grow a little more impatient, and they wanted him to choose. You have to choose. 7 years ahead, you need to choose and start soon. And then, one day, his father came back from the smithy, and he had had a conversation with someone who had had a conversation with the Bodger. And he presented this to young James and said, "The Bodger is looking for an apprentice." Now immediately James was interested, because he had no idea what a Bodger was. He was very curious, and he said, "Well, what's a Bodger?" His father said, "Well, he works out in the woods, and he makes table and chair legs out of trees, out of young trees. Cuts them down and tools them in some way into beautiful legs." That's what he does, and he does it out in the woods. Well, this sounded amazing to James. To spend the entire day in the woods just carving wood. That sounded fantastic. And he immediately said, "I want to be his apprentice." And his mother and father were very surprised by this. He hadn't shown any interest in any of the other options, and then suddenly he decided this is what he wanted to do. Well, they told him a little more about the Bodger, and that he was a curious fellow. He was very picky and had already turned down several boys who wished to be apprentices to him. But James was undaunted. He wanted to go. And so the following morning, very early, his mother woke him up and packed him a breakfast and lunch of biscuits and cheese, and gave that to him, and sent him to the edge of the forest where he needed to follow a certain trail. And that trail would eventually lead to the Bodger's hovel, which is not where he lives, but where he works. No one actually knew where the Bodger lived and spent the night. So we went. It was still dark, and it was late in the fall, so it was dark for quite a while. And he came to the edge of the forest and saw a ribbon tied around one of the trees right next to the trail, and he went onto the trail. And by now the sun was just starting to peek up over the horizon, so he had enough light to wend his way through the forest, follow that very thin trail. And it took some time, but eventually he could see a structure up ahead. He saw that it had stone and mud waddling in the back, and that it had a thatch straw roof and some sides made of thicker logs. Surely this was the Bodger's hovel. So he knew that the Bodger was very picky and that he wanted to make a very good impression. So he stood up as tall as he could. He made sure that he looked very clean, thought about what he was going to say, and then went to the front of the hovel to look inside. but there was no one there. Tools were there, some stools, some chair or table legs that were being worked on. Clearly this was the right place, but the Bodger was not there. So he thought to himself, well, I guess I need to go find him. And so he turned and looked out into the woods and saw no clear place to go. But what else could he do? And he loved the woods, and so he began to wander. He walked and listened to the sound of the leaves and the twigs crackling under his feet. He would often look up and see how the trees were leaning in the breeze back and forth and sometimes clattering their twigs and branches together. It was very pleasant. He was very happy. And then he came to one tree. It was an oak tree, and he looked up the tree. It was a big oak tree, and those were his favorite. And he looked way to the top and saw how the branches at the end were dancing about, and he himself began to move a little bit like those branches when he heard a voice. It was from behind him, and the voice said, "Turn around." So he did. He turned around, and there, standing not too far away, but facing directly toward him, was an old man. White beard, shoulder-length white hair, leathery skin, strong shoulders, strong hands, but standing perfectly tall and still. And all the old man said was, "Good." Now, there was something curious about the old man, aside from the fact that he was very still and had seemingly appeared out of nowhere right there, but he was looking in James' direction, but not directly at him, as if he was looking at something else. But then very swiftly, the old man turned to a young tree, not very wide around, a trunk about that size, went to the base and somehow produced a blade, a saw blade, and cut it at the base. The tree fell. And the old man looked in James' direction again and said, "Follow me, and we'll bring it back to the hovel." And then James knew that this old man was the Bodger. Then the old man started walking off, and he walked in a curious way too, where he walked very confidently and steadily through the woods, but he had his hands out in front of him, as if he was feeling the air or something. And it took James' attention for a moment, but then he realized he needed to get the tree. So very quickly he took up the tree, the young tree, and began tugging it and walking as quickly as he could behind this old man, behind the old Bodger. And he wanted to make a good impression, so he worked very hard to keep pace with him, until eventually they made it there to the hovel, and the old man directed him to bring the log into the hovel, or bring the tree trunk into the hovel, and to sit at a particular spot. And then James noticed something. As the old man was there and orienting himself to sit down as well, he saw that the old man was feeling around the hovel, exactly where to sit, exactly where the tools were. And then James realized the old man was blind. This was a little confusing at first. How could a blind man live in the woods, work in the woods, and make these chair legs and these table legs? How was that possible? But then very shortly after that, he had another thought. This could actually be a wonderful apprenticeship, because how would the old man know what he was doing? He could spend as much time as he wanted to just wander or dream, look up at the trees, do what he loved most, so long as he appeared or sounded like he was working. Well, he didn't have that thought for very long, because as he sat there with the tree trunk now at his feet, the old man said, "Have you worked a draw blade before?" And The truth was, he hadn't worked a draw blade before. He didn't even know what a draw blade was, but again, he wanted to make a good impression, and James said, "Yes, lots of times." And then it was quiet. And then the Bodger, after a moment, asked him a second question. "Do you know what the most important thing there is to bodging?" James thought about this for a moment and then answered, "A draw blade?" "No," said the old Bodger. And James then looked around the hovel and saw several tools and saw a big saw and thought, that's got to be what it is. And he said, "A saw?" And the man said, "No. The most important thing to bodging, boy, is the truth. For without the truth, you will get lost in the woods. You will not know which trees to cut, and you will not know how to cut them." This was a little confusing to James. How could the truth be the most important thing? And then the Bodger took him off guard and said, "You answered my question with a lie. You have not worked with a draw blade. You have no idea what a draw blade is. If you wish to work here, boy, I'm going to need the truth." Well, James was not prepared for that. How did this old blind man know that he was not telling the truth? But he took in a breath and said, "All right. I haven't worked with a draw blade before." And the old man said, "Good." And then he proceeded to hand him a draw blade. He showed him exactly how to hold it and instructed him to limb the trunk, take all the branches off of the trunk, and then use the draw blade to continue to shave off all the bark. He showed him how to do it, he explained how to do it, and then gave it to James to finish the task. And James took it, and at first he worked very hard, very diligently, very carefully, and did exactly what the Bodger had done by taking off the branches and the bark, and he worked, and then after a while his mind began to wander. He started looking around the hovel, and then he noticed the Bodger, who was working hard at carving away at one of the legs, and it was beautiful what he was doing, so deftly, so carefully, and the angles and the ripples and all the carving, it was gorgeous, and he kind of lost himself in that. And then he realized that he hadn't been working, but then he had a thought similar to a previous thought, and he thought, if I just make the sound that I'm stripping the bark off, what will the Bodger know? He can't see. And so he started idly just bringing the knife back and forth over the trunk while he just looked around the room and was very curious about all the different tools and how the room was made, and he began to dream, and then suddenly the old man spoke again. "Truth is not only vital in words, but in actions, boy. If you do not wish to do the work, you can go back to your mother and father's home. But if you wish to stay and learn something, then I will need truth in actions and words. A person is as good as their word, so I expect you to do what you say you're going to do." Well, James had been caught twice now. He didn't need to be told again. "I want to do the work," he said. And then the Bodger was silent and let him be, and James went back to limbing and shaving the bark, and when he was finished, the Bodger felt it and told him places where he could improve and places where he had done very well, and that made James feel good, like he had done something, he had learned something, and in fact he had had some success. So they had lunch, And then the Bodger led him back out into the woods. They were going to go get another tree. And he moved so carefully, so easily through the woods. James was amazed and actually had to keep pace with the old man, weaving in between the trees. How could he do it? And then they came to a stand of young beech trees. And the Bodger put his hand on one of them and seemed to look up, and then turned in James' direction and said, "Earlier, did you hear a voice before you saw me?" And James remembered the voice that he heard that said, "Turn around." And James said, "Yes, I heard your voice." And this made the Bodger smile. And he put his hand on another tree and looked up again and said, "The voice you heard was not mine. You see, you heard the voice of the forest. Every one of these trees has a voice. Call it what you may. Nature, spirit, elf, fairy, it doesn't matter. But every tree has a voice, and if you are sensitive enough, if you listen closely enough, you will hear it, or at least feel it. How else do you think a blind man can move through a forest full of trees? No, I am glad you could hear that." And then he dipped down, cut down another tree, handed it to the boy, and that was all that was said. Followed him back. They worked until dusk, and the Bodger said, "Come back tomorrow at dawn. I will let you work here another day." And James was grateful and excited, and couldn't wait to get home to tell his parents about it. He made it home, excitedly told them about his day. They were very impressed. Decided he wanted to go to bed early because he needed to get up early, and on his own the following morning he woke, he made himself breakfast, he made his parents breakfast, packed himself some more biscuits and cheese for a late breakfast and lunch, and then went back into the woods. Quickly found his way to the Bodger's hovel, looked inside, and was a little delighted to see that it was empty again, because again he needed to find the Bodger. So he turned around, faced toward the wide open woods, and then he suddenly remembered what the Bodger had said about these nature spirits, about these voices, these feelings in the woods, and he decided to try what it might be like to be blind. He closed his eyes. And as he closed his eyes and listened to the trees moving, clickety-clack, moaning, creaking, listened to the scuffling of squirrels in the distance, or maybe the breeze blowing some of the leaves about, he didn't hear a voice per se, but he felt a certain warmth in a particular direction. And the warmth seemed to say to him, "This way." So he went that way. And he decided not to open his eyes. He was going to try to do this with his eyes closed. And he went this way, and it wasn't easy. He tripped a few times, he bumped into a few trees, but he kept at it, just tapping in and feeling and paying attention to that warmth to go this way, this way, this way. And he didn't know if he had been walking for minutes or hours. But eventually, he had the sensation, and then he heard the voice, "Open your eyes." And he opened his eyes, and there standing before him was the old Bodger, who had a big smile on his face. And the Bodger said, "Good." The choice was made. James became his apprentice, and he stayed with him for 7 full years, learning not only the art and craft of good bodging, but he also learned how to pay attention, how to use his sensitivity, and most of all, how to always tell and act the truth. And that seems like a good place to stop for now. May your Advent season be filled with things that you notice for the first time, surprises, things that your sensitivity open you to, new people, new colors, new experiences. May there be lots of discovery this season. And maybe we'll meet back here, and maybe I'll have some walls in place and a little insulation so that there can be a little bit more warmth in here. Until then, bye-bye.